Pleased to be joined here today behind me by Jackie Johnson, Anna Scarbeck and Robin Quiggin, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We are going to be unpacking over the next 45 minutes or so the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap that was launched on Tuesday this week. A really important and exciting piece of work that many in our sector and many, in fact, probably of you on the line have been contributing to over 18 months, nearly 2 years. And it's setting out a really important plan for us as an industry. And I think there's a lot that has come up today in our discussions that really underscores the importance of that work. And we're going to unpack that with three of the steering committee members joining me today. To start this session, I have set up a bit of a poll there though, and I'd ask people to look online at that poll, because what we have seen with this sort of rapid development of sustainable finance policy around the world over the last couple of years is there's a few core pieces of policy levers that we see that have come up through many of the international frameworks around the world as really important pieces in driving and embedding sustainability in the financial services sector. And so to start this, I thought I'd throw a few up there and just see what people on the line sort of think as some of the most important levers or actions that we can take to align finance with a sustainable and Paris-aligned future. So we have there, I'll watch that as those come in, and we shall talk to that in a moment. But I'm going to welcome our guests. And so I've got three of my fellow steering committee members up on the wall behind me. Hi all, thanks for joining me. So Jackie Johnson is my co-chair of ASFI. So we've spent the last 18 months or more working very closely together on this Sustainable Finance Roadmap. And I welcome Jackie. We've all got our bios on the website, right? And so I thought I'm going to pick out some interesting facts of each of our speakers for this afternoon. And I think I've learned a lot about insurance in the last year and a half working with Jackie, who's been a very senior executive across IAG for quite a long time, and including the CEO of IAG's New Zealand business at the time of the Christchurch earthquakes, and was leading much of the work there. And so I think that experience, what that's brought to ASFI in terms of really understanding resilience and shocks and vulnerability has just been so important. And I think that's something I've learnt a lot through Jackie and your experience, Jackie, in that time there. Robin Quiggin, Professor of UTS Business School, a Wurundjeri lawyer with extensive experience across consumer advocacy, policy, legal work, in particular as it relates to Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, with an amazing experience actually across working of ASIC, Australian Human Rights Commission. But I think one of the interesting things, Robin, we haven't had enough time to talk about over the last year and a half is actually your interest in the arts and your experience on the boards of such as Bangarra Dance Company and as an ex-trustee of the Australian Museum. So I was interested might draw out a few of those threads of yours and how that's maybe informed your contribution to the ASFI roadmap. Anna Scarbeck, who also many of us may have known with a really long an extensive career in this area of what we call today sustainable finance, but probably related to climate change and investing, going way back to work through Macquarie Bank as one of the first directors on the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and wears a number of hats now, mainly the CEO of the Climate Works Australia. But I was also interested in the other hats you're wearing, particularly the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, ex-board of Amnesty International. So a very well-rounded set of panellists here to join me today to unpack the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap. So thank you for joining me. What we're going to start this session with actually is Jackie and I are going to walk you through a high-level summary of the roadmap itself that was launched. And so, Jackie, I'm going to pull up the slides now and ask if you're able to talk us through the first few slides which introduce the roadmap and the background of it and the core objectives of what we were aiming to achieve there. So, Jackie, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Simon. And first, I'd like to say what a successful conference that you've been able to have. I know it was a bit of a disappointment when you had to move the conference from early this year, but it sounds like the timing has been perfect. And also to call out Simon's role as co-chair of ASFI, and has been a great colleague to us with his thought leadership also, and bringing his years of experience in sustainable finance to the table. But Australia's Sustainable Finance Initiative is quite a unique initiative in that it brings our sectors across the finance system together, which ironically, I think in Australia, all of us played to the strengths within our own careers of our own part in that finance system. So 140 participants across 80 organisations have worked over the last 18 months together. And that's been complemented with our regulators, state, federal and local government, academia, with Robin playing a very active role, but some of her colleagues across different universities, and civil society. And so it's unique because we're industry-led and government-supported in terms of the way government is engaged, where other financial roadmaps around the world has tended to be government-led and then engaged with industry later as it came to implementation. So we feel that the way ASFI has come together means that we're taking responsibility and accountability as an industry in our own right. It all started back in July 2018 when we asked UNEP FI, and Eric Usher will be joining this panel a little later, to come and support us in a summit where we would bring people across Australia and New Zealand to discuss the whole topic of sustainable finance. And out of that came a commitment to develop our roadmap. And here we are with the launch week occurring. If I can move to the next slide, which helps us think about what was the vision. And the vision was about, let's not produce a report where the finance sector then tells everyone else what we need you to do if we could then make system change. It was about the finance system taking accountability for what we feel we could do to create a system change, but calling out where we do need some support and help, but primarily taking the responsibility ourselves. And there are 5 key parts that I think are important to stress here, and that we ourselves recognise that for a successful Australia, we need to be sustainable, resilient and stable in our own right as a finance sector, and to open to any shocks and stresses. And I think this year, through COVID-19, has highlighted how important a stable and resilient finance sector, both what we've seen with superannuation, with banking and with insurance. And so that, as part of our vision for ASFI, is a very important one. The second one is that we need to make sure that we balance the current needs of Australians with the future needs. And being a new grandparent this year, it's been very much on my mind, that intergenerational part of leadership that we have to play. But it's also about how do we balance the social, environmental and economic factors, and that it's not a trade-off conversation. And all of SteerCo have been passionate that you can't just solve a climate-related issue and then cause social issues that go alongside that. And certainly people like Robin has been very instrumental in us thinking about the human rights components of that and inclusivity. The third piece was helping everyone who relies on our system to have a greater level of financial literacy. How do we make sure that people are informed about what they're purchasing and are able to consider the risks, the impacts and the opportunities on sustainability? So it's not just a finance language or an academic language, that it becomes part of people considering how they live their life. And then financial inclusion has been a significant part of our vision. You know, I think for me, it's simply explained about how do we make sure the finance system is accessible for all Australians at the time they need it most and in the way they need it most. And I think we've got a way to go in that. And then making sure capital can flow to the areas where we need it to help with transition to a successful economy with all the changes we will face for the future. So that was the vision. And now if we move on to what our objectives were, it was very much those 4 objectives about meeting consumer and community expectations. What was really interesting was there was quite a bit of debate about the word consumer, because that then assumes that we're only looking at the people who are buying our products now. And if we really want to be inclusive, then that leaves out the broader community. So bringing consumer and community together in that objective was really important. And then you can see the other objectives actually line up with the vision that I just called out. And importantly, there are 4 agreements that the Australian government have committed to. And we want to make sure that the roadmap and the report was inclusive enough to support the whole of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I said, most of the roadmaps internationally are focused on climate related and the Paris Agreement. We wanted to make sure, as you can see by those 4 objectives on the screen, that it went across all of the goals, and that included the social, biodiversity, climate and economic. The Sendai Agreement, which obviously coming from an insurance background is really important about how do you think about disaster resilience, and then the biodiversity commitments that are being made as well. And so, Simon, I might hand over to you to actually round out the actual roadmap itself, what commitments we made and what the recommendations and actions are. Thanks, Simon.
Great, thank you, Jackie. And so where we've landed there, and we move on to that next slide, if we can keep those slides up there, is overarching the outcome of this process has realised that there are 4 key commitments that financial services entities really need to be committing to in order for us to achieve this vision. And those range from each individual entity making commitments around net zero emissions is really core to that. That at a leadership level, we need to really be embedding commitments to sustainability in the culture and leadership of our organisations. And I think what's really important and sort of the less sexy part of this, but the really important part is the value in cross-sectoral collaboration. And I think that is something that has been really unique to what ASFI has been able to do, is actually bring together a collaboration across all of financial services, groups that don't usually sit together and work together, from insurance, from banking, from investment, from academia, from government, from regulators and from civil society, because ultimately the complex challenges we're trying to contribute to solving here are going to require complex solutions and collaboration to navigate them. We've heard these themes come up numerous times today, but this has really gotten to a point where it's beyond just a single fund manager managing a risk within a portfolio. You know, these are systemic, broad issues, and so we're really, really key that collaboration continues. The way we thought through these recommendations, and in the roadmap you'll see a list of 37 recommendations sitting under 4 domains or 4 key areas of recommendations, as you see here again. Effectively, the way these play out is that in creating this broad system level change, there are multiple areas we need to work on, which needs work from multiple different levels of actors or stakeholders in the financial services area. And so of these 37 recommendations, you see some that relate to investors, some that relate to banks, some that relate to insurers, some to all financial services. There are those that relate to regulators and policymakers. There are those that relate to consumers and beneficiaries. And there are those that are really national level recommendations. And it is the suite of these, the coordination of all of these recommendations in aggregate that can create and lead to that system level change that we desire. And so these 37 recommendations that operate at 5 different levels under 4 different areas, I hope you're keeping up with the 4s and the 5s and the 37s. It's that in aggregate that is what becomes a roadmap to deliver a decade's worth of change. And so without going through 37 recommendations in detail, and we can start drawing them out a little bit in our conversation, but these are the kinds of things we see under each of these sets of recommendations. And I guess the way we see this is that in order to achieve the goal we're after, we need a few areas to work together. So we need culture and leadership and targets and commitments really embedded at the top of financial services. And so some of those recommendations involve things like net zero commitments, sustainability embedded into strategy, even into remuneration. We need then, and we've heard this again today, this convergence and standardisation of frameworks of the way we disclose, of the way we manage data, of the guidance, of regulation, of the practices of valuation. They're really the tools of our trade. And so we talk in those recommendations around things such as TCFD disclosures, taxonomy, sustainability disclosures, stewardship codes. So really to get some industry-wide harmonisation around these practices is really critical. It's those two in combination that really can help unlock number 4, which is about how we see capital flowing towards the types of assets that we need to be investing in today in order to achieve these goals, such as the SDGs and such as the Paris Agreement and such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so it's really through those that we can really help to develop the architecture underneath markets to create markets to unlock capital flows. And so we talk in the report about a number of different markets where this is relevant, from impact investing that we've heard of just recently in a previous session, natural capital markets, the way we invest in real assets such as infrastructure, residential housing, commercial buildings, transport, the sustainable bond markets, and it's all about getting that market architecture right to really create the sustainable capital flows. But number 3 there, which is really important and an element that I think was somewhat unique to the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative process when compared to other international equivalents, is really this strong focus on the consumer, on our clients. It's reminding us that we're all as a sector managing other people's money or acting on their behalf, and that's and so really keeping the consumer primacy is key. And so a lot of the recommendations there are around things such as transparency, consistency of labelling of how we talk about sustainability products, so that consumers can navigate to products that match their interests, their preferences, their desires and needs, but also a lot around financial inclusion, servicing our most vulnerable customers, ensuring we are set up properly to really support community finance. And so it's really, again, the combination of those that can help us to deliver the ultimate objectives of the roadmap. And so in the reports, we see really a staged plan here as to how we as a sector are committing to move forward to implement this roadmap. That's my final slide, so we can end the slides there and get back to our sort of discussion around this. There's a lot in that. I think what's really important to us, as Jackie mentioned, is that this is a financial services sector roadmap by industry, for industry, informed by other stakeholders, our customers, our government, our regulators. But what we really set out from the outset to do is not to develop a wish list for government. This is really a set of largely recommendations that we as a sector, of those of us watching today, can be part of driving forward and can be part of implementing. And really, this is, by formulating the roadmap, it's kind of the end of the beginning, and now the work begins to implement that roadmap, which is both exciting and daunting at the same time, I think. But but it really sets out a really clear program of work for us to help deliver and to continue to collaborate on to help deliver going forward. So with that, I want to stop talking about this. I'm interested, actually, just before we go to our speakers, the polling that's coming in is saying that, the top, the single most important action that we can take to align finance with a sustainable future, 40% of the vote have said have sustainability metrics in remuneration of executives. So that's really interesting that there's strong support for that. Then leadership as the second highest one, in embedding sustainability in leadership at board and executive level. So I think that's really fascinating, because that was really a huge theme and an area that was quite dear to the hearts of the steering committee members, actually. And then we go down to setting net zero emissions targets as the next highest priority. Developing data for environmental and social externalities, and saying that beyond carbon. Then TCFD disclosures, taxonomies below that. But that's really interesting. And actually, maybe I'll start with that as a kind of a springing into this conversation. But we want to kind of move in and sort of hear from each of our panellists here as to what they have sort of taken as really important and stand out as part of this process and the roadmap. And I guess through that, kind of drawing on some of the recommendations that really are really important and meaningful from your perspectives. And I thought, Anna, it might be worth starting with you, because I think through Climate Works Australia, it's been really important for us to understand the sort of the pathways and the gaps and what we need to do to get to where we need to get to. It's kind of now about filling in, well, how do we kind of unlock and start directing capital in that direction? So I think there's quite a lot of complementarity, but I'll stop there and pass to you, Anna, and just get you to sort of bring in your remarks at this point.
Thanks, Simon, and congratulations to you and Jackie for chairing the ASFI Steering Committee, and to all of the finance sector executives. I know there were 140 in the 5 working groups, but I know many more were involved in supporting their colleagues to produce that work. So it really is a report, as you said, by the sector, for the sector. So, and I know how much work you spent on it. So I just wanted to start with that and say thank you on behalf of the rest of us that you brought all of this together, and we've been happy to contribute to it. It's an exciting time, but also a massive question that you've asked, sort of what stands out from this roadmap, and what do we mean by pathways? So ClimateWorks, as many of you know, specialises in pathways to net zero emissions, and the technologies for those are well understood now. Our research has shown through the 4 pillars that we talk about, 3 of them energy, the 4th sequestration, saving energy, being more energy productive and efficient, switching to renewable electricity, and then switching to electricity and other fuel switch, which now includes hydrogen, which enables the last of the hard to abate sectors, if you like, to eliminate emissions from the supply chains of oil and gas, of coal making for steel. We know now that it can be done, that we can eliminate emissions from our economy, and where there are residual, particularly from agriculture and some of the last of the residual industrial processes, we know we can capture, whether industrially with CCS, for example, on cement plants, or naturally with carbon forestry, soil carbon investments, perennial grasses, deeper rooted crops, and regenerative agriculture. So when you ask the pathways question, that's the first response from ClimateWorks, that we share those scenarios. We've mapped multiple scenarios with CSIRO and made those available to many financial institutions and worked with them to tailor it to state government jurisdictions as well. But you asked a second question, which is what else is involved in making this happen, and what are the opportunities and the barriers there? So when we think pathways, we also look at, well, if all of this is available to us, the technology, well, why isn't it happening? So what does that take? And for me, I really see that that's what ASFI has addressed this time around, is how do we help all of this come to life? And I know we'll have the opportunity in the rest of this discussion to talk about what are the bits of the ASFI roadmap that we think make most of a difference in bringing all of this to life. And I think your audience were correct in, our recommendation number 1 is about baking it into the remuneration. I used to work in a bank, I know how it works. But also I see in the barriers that the finance sector has not just a role in catching up, if you like, in embedding sustainability into its operations and procurement, but also in helping design the implementation pathways for those technology pathways that I talked about. So the technology exists, but it is not yet widespread. It's not yet the normal. It's not yet the default product. And often the reason for that is a business model question. And for me, as a former banker, behind that sits a financing structure in question, really. Business model is about who gets paid, who gets charged, who's the customer, where's the revenue. And that is often what is the barrier. There are obviously some basic cost economics, and that's why we have the Federal Technology Investment Roadmap that can help bring down the costs of some of the new technologies. But there are many already that are invented and cost effective, but not easy to purchase. There's not a one-stop shop provider, it's not well understood, or that the upfront cost doesn't include the operating, and we don't do whole of life costing as customers. So in the energy space in particular, but also transport, industry, housing, built environment, these sorts of barriers to implementation can be resolved by finance sector and businesses working together to assume that the new normal we need is that these technologies are the default. So how can you change the terms of your contracts? How can you change the incentives and your pricing? How can you change what you ask of your supply chain? How can you change how you define what you will or won't accept in bids and so on? So I'd like to leave it there, but I think those are the sorts of questions that I know if this roadmap does its job, then the talented people who work inside financial institutions will be asking themselves those questions and asking their B2B partners and their corporate partners, and needing to lean in and work with their consumers, as you've mentioned, and their peers. Very much this is sector-based now, some of these solutions, and so solving it together is a new business skill. So I think we have written enough guidance in this roadmap to trigger that sort of questioning, and I'm hoping that that's the result in terms of the mindset shift. And once we ask those questions, we know we can answer them, but it takes some good, smart people in a room together to do it.
That's great, Anna. You know, I was sitting here listening to that, thinking around the steering committee table, we didn't have a lot of time to really sit and reflect as to what we think is kind of stands out and why, you know, what we feel is important. And so it's actually an interesting chance to do that. And Robin, I wanted to pass to you, just saying, what, you know, what's your reflection now, sitting at this point, a couple of days after launching it, after all this work, of why it stands out as important? Because I think there's a few unique elements we've tried to unpack and do justice to in this roadmap. And I think your skill set around the table was a really unique and valuable contribution to that. And so I'd love to hear your views as you sit here around sort of the importance of the work and what stands out to you.
Thanks, Simon, and hello, everybody. It's you know, a good conversation to be having on a Friday afternoon at the end of the week. It's been a really big week, and it's been really exciting to launch this and be part of this. And I also want to you know, pay respect to Simon and Jackie for the work that they've undertaken, and all the colleagues. It was, you know, when talking about something that was created by industry for industry, essentially industry in the community, the great benefit of that for me is that all the industry people know where the issues are, know where the levers, the opportunities, the roadblocks, the risks, and you know your sector, you know your industry. So it's absolutely fantastic to be working, to be part of something that was industry led. I think about the system that that Simon was describing and the layers to it. It sounds very theoretical, I guess, in a way, when you sort of look at it and see it as a map. However, I've just been giving some thought to the complexities of COVID, how we have dealt with balancing rights around economic rights, health rights, and working across health systems, ageing systems, transport systems, working from home. We've just come through, or are in the middle, still coming through, an example of the kind of complexity that this roadmap is talking about, how we bring all the moving parts together. And we've just seen that kind of in action in relation to a big crisis. So I think, you know, that this roadmap is, there are complexities and there are simplicities, and I think we are more and more familiar with them, particularly in this post-COVID era, because we are used to thinking about systems now. We're used to thinking about moving parts. Anna referred to the, in relation to technology, about getting the finance. It's absolutely true for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have had, you know, people make, you know, spend their lifetimes campaigning for land rights, for native title rights, and we now have a lot of that recognised. And lots of, you know, we absolutely want economic development on country. We want jobs for people on country. We want security. We want homes. We want water. We want sustainable lives on country. So we've got the land, but getting the investment in on land that is not, that's not fungible, on land where it's very hard to take security, has been a real roadblock to ways to think about development. The roadmap, one of the suggestions about the roadmap is setting up a First Peoples Financial Services office to start having more of these conversations, to think about the ways to do this, to think about also Indigenous consumers of financial services. Now, we have a lot of organisations that do a lot of that work, but this is to actually think about that investment piece specifically, and how to make systems change, how to bring our minds to a better place, a place where we do have sustainability, where we recognise First Peoples, where we are making arrangements, making deals that actually benefit people. And I don't know if I'm preempting, Simon, but, you know, I think you were asking me before about my engagement in and my role at the Australian Museum and on Bangarra and as a lawyer for artists. Culture is at the heart of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Culture and land, water. We are country. We are culture. What we saw in the blowing up of the Juukan Mine caves is unforgivable. And this roadmap actually, and that First People's Financial Services Office can have a role in bringing us to a more rights-based approach where we can actually start having sensible conversations about how to prevent that kind of thing in the future. So I think this, is a fabulous piece of work. It is about systems change, and it is about tackling the tricky things, the thorny things, the things we haven't known how to do, and working out ways to get that done.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks. That's great. It struck me during that, and Jackie, I might pass to you. Like, it was really, I guess it was fundamentally informed and shaped our thinking that COVID was occurring during part of this process. And we got this question on Tuesday, actually. And I would like to just see if, one is asking that question of why it's important from where you sit, because I think we don't often get to sort of break that down and talk personally where this comes from, but also interested in your thoughts or your reflections on how COVID has actually shaped the nature of this roadmap, because I think when we look at other international roadmaps, we've seen they've been very climate heavy. And from the outset, our remit was broader than that. And so I wouldn't mind your reflections on that, how COVID has sort of shaped our thinking around this.
Yeah, well, I think firstly, I'd congratulate all the members of ASFI that we were able to adapt very quickly, because of course we were planning our launch in July and that we would have our regular meetings face-to-face and with such complex working groups. To see how everyone with very busy day jobs just accommodated virtual connections and us then moving to a virtual launch. But the reality is we did need to consider the COVID environment as it was unfolding, because it was teaching us so much. It was teaching us about the connectedness across the goals of the SDGs. And when you started to see the balance of health discussions as well as employee discussions, and then thinking about employment and then the future economy, we've seen it play out. The whole system consideration needs to be in place. And so I think for us as ASFI, we were part of those discussions in organisations, and then we were seeing what we needed then to consider. And so that we needed to be making sure that we just didn't follow the route of just being a green taxonomy, and that we actually started to understand this interconnection. And throughout the report, you'll see that. I mean, one of the challenges I think is everyone will, and I saw this when I was leading the earthquake recoveries, you gravitate to the last experience you had in a shock or a stress. And there are no, in my environment, having managed quite a few disaster recoveries, no two play out the same. So what you need to understand is what are the dynamics within the system that actually help with the recovery, but what are the learnings that can help mitigate future shock from the stresses that will continue, and whether it's going to be cyber risk, whether it's going to be terrorist, whether it's going to be pandemic, or whether it's going to be climate shocks. We have to be ready as a finance sector to help Australia navigate through all of those, because you can't eliminate risk from society. And so for me, I think COVID helped us as ASFI really consider that and know that we had to embed a set of recommendations that would fit for whatever the shock and the stress is going forward, not just COVID-19 or not just climate change.
Thank you. Anna, I guess getting into some of the specific recommendations, there's a couple of ways of doing this. Either we talk about 37 recommendations, we're here till 6 p.m. tonight, or we sort of pick out a few favourites. And I don't know if we're allowed to have favourites, or I guess things that, you think stands out as significant particular areas from where you sit. What are some of those levers that will create the biggest change from your perspective? Anna, I'm interested in your views now.
Sure, and great question. And on the COVID point just earlier, I will also just add, in addition to everything that was said, the other thing that COVID has done for me is accentuate my hope as well as my fear about our ability to address climate change, that element of it. The hope being the pace of change. Our reports have always said we need to see a greater pace of change, of investment in the solutions to climate change. And we knew we were almost apologetic in saying, sorry guys to have to tell you it's this much more than before. And then COVID happened, and it was like, wow, this pace of change, there's nothing compared to what the world was just experiencing. And so I'm actually hopeful that it rebases people's understanding of what we're all capable of. Actually, markets can change. Things can digitise quickly. Preferences can shift. Humans can adapt. And obviously, it's an entirely different type of shift, what COVID has done versus what the largely technological upgrade and business model shift that climate change asks. But I wanted to make that link about pace of change. And then obviously there's the risk of distraction, that if COVID sends the world into recession and distracts leaders, we're at great risk of not addressing climate change in the time that we've got left. So we've got this opportunity to achieve the double dividend of doing the two at the same time, recovering from COVID, doing all the learning and reflecting that Jackie mentioned, while ensuring that all of those steps in recovery and continuing that pace are aligned. So with that said, to your other question about, well, what are my favourites or what is significant in the recommendations, I've got to say 3 things that are significant to me was firstly that it wasn't a fight. So I've worked in climate change for many decades. And I am not joking when I can say that the experience on the steering group struck me for its absence of fight. In that there is an alignment now, an understanding of what is needed, of what good should be, could be, and there wasn't a fight about whether we should go there at all. And even about how to go there didn't really generate a fight. I'd say we were refining. Like if something didn't seem right, could this be improved? There was an upward trajectory sense in the room in terms of we were aiming for how could it be better, not trying to tear it apart. That is refreshing for someone who's spent a decade in this space, but also really encouraging for the momentum that I think sits behind this. The other thing for me that's significant is the breadth and the depth. So it's not just climate, and it's not just the external trajectories. Obviously, I will say that commitment to have trajectories to net zero is absolutely fundamental in my view, but it goes to the organisation, putting it into remuneration. It goes to education about supporting centres of sustainable finance in universities, and it goes beyond climate, as you mentioned. And certainly the SDGs have taught us, Sustainable Development Goals, that we actually do better at solving one if we're solving the others at the same time. And as COVID showed, we can be multi-goal oriented. So it actually excites me that it's broader because I think the tougher the challenge, if you like, the more your brain is stretched, the better you get at solving hard things, because it forces you to think differently than just do an incremental improvement, which really means you're standing where you were before and not moving as much as when you think, whoa, how can I possibly address all of those things at one time? Let's do something quite different, change our mindsets. So that excites me. And then I said depth because it's not high-level general statements, it's quite specific. And I find that really exciting because it's clear guidance to people who haven't been close to it, and it also doesn't shirk from exactly what is needed. Go back to the net zero trajectories example, but there are disclosure requirements in there, and quite also what I'm interested in is to see that the TNFD is mentioned. So TCFD has become normalised fairly quickly, but there's guidance in there about making sure everyone actually does report on a why not, if not why not basis. So that, for me, that's almost good hygiene. TCFD has become the good baseline for understanding risk and opportunity around climate risk. And then we've got the TNFD emerging this year. And this roadmap has not just said, oh, well, we'll just do a watching brief on that. It's like, right, it's coming. We've got to be ready for it. Let's help shape it. TNFD meaning the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. There's a big biodiversity summit next year. Nature-based solutions are key. So it'll be really exciting that that all comes together in the same year that implementation begins here. So I thought I might use those 2 examples to call out a big one, an obvious one, around the net zero by 2050, and the myriad of recommendations that sit behind that about providing support for the sector on scenarios, asking the regulators to do guidance. Like, it's quite comprehensive. That's what I meant by its depth. And then to call out some of the smaller ones, like this focus on nature-based solutions, which I don't think will be small for long, and everything in between. 37, it's not difficult reading to anybody who is put off by that number. Don't be. The summaries are really accessible, and I think they are the roadmap that everyone will have on their desk, virtual or not, to guide actions every year for every person this decade.
That's great, Anna. I really loved that summary, and I was really encouraged that when we were stretching our brains, it was making us smarter. It wasn't just giving us headaches, because there were moments there where that did feel like it was stretching our brains in a number of directions at once. But thank you. That was really, really lovely summation of that process. And I think that, I think many of us around the Steerco were really encouraged by the attitude that everyone around that table brought to those discussions. I think that was a really nice reflection of that internal working of that grouping, and it's possible to, it's probably, I guess at the outset we just didn't know how that would work, that dynamic of that group of people and those organisations around that table. So, I guess there was an unknown there. So, that was really encouraging. Robin, I'd love to ask you the same question, as what sort of stands out as really significant in terms of specific areas within this roadmap from your perspective?
Thanks, Simon. And that was lovely listening to Anna as well. And I just want to just reflect on bringing everybody together and the way instigated by our colleague from QBE, Sharanjit Paradam, we held a smoking ceremony at the beginning of our discussions. We had fellows from Yuin Nation, South Coast, come, and it was the freezingest cold, windy day, up on the roof, and security had organised for that, there would be no fire alarms going off. And the working group for that particular working group, we stood around and we were smoked, we were spoken to in language, and we were given a really, really strong cultural experience on the 30th floor with the wind howling, looking out over the harbour. And who would have thought, and I think the ancestors, the Gadigal ancestors, could never have imagined that, this would be the architecture on their country, but that here we would be in our suits and our overcoats undertaking a spiritual and cultural ceremony. So it was a very good start. That was a really great start. And for me, I think when we look at the roadmap and the document, it's speaking to and elevating the human right of free, prior and informed consent when engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on their country in relation to their resources. It's such an important human right. If you can get that right, the rest will really, really follow. Because what that's about, it's not a compliance thing. It's not a ticking a box thing. It's about relationships and engagement and getting to know people and an exchange. And if you are a proponent, if you are doing business on country, it's about having that ongoing relationship with those people. If you're financing business on country, it's about that being related to the proponent and the country and the people. That is a really important human right to support. It's really pivotal to all work that goes on, and if we can do that better, we'll do really well. We will not see something like the Juukan Caves happen, and despite rhetoric that free, prior and informed consent was done, it wasn't. What we will get then out of those relationships and that engagement is also a better understanding from the knowledge holders who have cared for this country for 60,000 years, knowledge holders who know how to look after this place. And we will manage to look after our national heritage. It's not just the heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it is the heritage of the nation. And in this thinking about, again, back to thinking about the system change that we've had to undertake with COVID, I read a beautiful quote, and maybe some of you are familiar with it, but when we're looking at thinking about the economy and the livelihoods, the economy and life, the economy and quality of life for us, there's no livelihood without life. And there is no livelihood and no life without country. So we have to look after country. We have to be able to care for this place and work with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been doing it for 60,000 years, engaging, forming relationships that will serve the country, serve business, and serve the planet. And so I am really excited to see that right in there, because it is pivotal, it can be done, and it can be done by people engaging strongly on it. Thanks.
Great, Robin, thank you. Jackie, you know, we've kind of been in the whirlwind of kind of trying to get this thing out, but I don't know that we've really talked about what, you know, stands out for you personally as really significant at this point, a few days afterwards. What are your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm very passionate about how this whole agenda has to move into strategy, and it has to be seen as, and I think Anna referenced this, about the fundamental part of your business model. And I think for too long, it's been about risk management, and the very fact that sustainability often was about how, and investors have often led the discussion in this way, about how do you make sure that you're negatively screening and how do you make sure that harm's not done, where I think what we're seeing is this shift about if it's part of your strategy and part of what the purpose of your company is, culturally you'll start to direct it to be, what are the opportunities to be able to be relevant in the future? Because if you don't do that, then you won't be around as a company. We talk about tech disruption. This could be the biggest disruption, to meaning a company cannot exist because they're no longer relevant to all their stakeholders. And we're seeing that from a customer and an employee point of view. I mean, we're seeing more and more employees, and particularly in a year of reflection about what's important to them, is saying if you're suddenly as a company reporting through sustainability reporting, and that doesn't make sense to what your employee is experiencing internally, and it's some sort of story that you're putting out there in the market, then you're going to have a problem, because there'll be cynicism, and employees, when unemployment starts to change direction, people would leave, and then you can't even enact your business strategy. So I think what's exciting for me is that as Steerco, we all agree as senior leaders that that needed to be a very strong framing of the report. And so that it wasn't about, here's a list of tasks to be done. It ultimately has to go in there. And I think it was exciting to see the governance principles of the ASX this year actually reflecting that if you're a large company listed on a stock exchange, you need, as a board, to be able to know the purpose or mission of the company, and also the culture, and you're accountable for that. That's a huge shift. I will say too, having participated in many investor roadshows in my career, that often the questions around culture and your customers are asked when things are not going well. When money is being made, those questions don't get asked. And I would urge all the investors on this call to be really thinking about that. Because if it's part of strategy and part of culture of an organisation, then how the money's being made in good and bad times needs to be understood to know whether it's a worthwhile investment. And so I think deep in our report, that's the essence of what I'm taking out, and I'm quite excited that there will be a system shift.
That's great, Jackie, thank you. I wanted to just sort of finally move through for this section of this session before we welcome Eric Usher to, but I just bring in this to life and the next steps. And Jackie, I just wanted to get you to sort of summarise that implementation phase and what we have ahead of us now, as of really starting immediately.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So firstly, the Steerco are very committed to an ongoing body being formed, and obviously there's some work to be done of how we form that from a governance point of view and a funding perspective, but we're moving into transition phase now, and our transition phase has been funded to be able to frame a new entity and also to start working on implementation. The most important point is there is a commitment from all the participants in ASFI to take the report and then do a gap analysis with their own organisation. As it was highlighted before, Simon, by yourself, organisations are a different part of the journey, and also if it has to fit within your strategy, you need to make this relevant. And so that is one of the most important parts of implementation, how it becomes relevant for each organisation in the finance sector. And also, as said, for this body to be set up, and it's going to take a bit of thinking and a bit of work, it won't duplicate the industry bodies. I think, Simon, you mentioned that one of the most exciting things that we hadn't thought through was going to be so valuable was the fact that we had a cross-sector group where government and other stakeholders could come and engage, because usually they have to do it through banking, insurance, investing, without actually coming together in Australia and having one point. And so having a very small secretariat that actually can help coordinate the implementation of our recommendations, report and monitor, but also be that go-to for projects where people want to engage ASFI will be important. But I stress it's about working with our industry associations, not duplicating them as well. But really, it started this week. Every organisation that I've spoken to this week are busily looking at how it's fitting in their strategy cycle for next year as they, really do look at the recovery and their longer term strategy. Thanks, Simon.
Great, Jackie, and I think that's a really nice call to action for people on this call on the conference today, that this is intended as very much a checklist of recommendations that at an entity level you can all take and download, and there's a really handy action plan part of it there and effectively run a gap analysis. What are the things we already have in place? What are the things we need to be starting to look at working on? And that in aggregating all of that individual action is what helps to start driving the change at the industry-wide action. Just finally, there's a really nice little question here actually saying, how can government and or regulators support and accelerate momentum? And noting that carrots are good, sticks help too. And I think we didn't shy away from that. I think we agree. And there are a number of references in the report around areas the regulators can specifically tighten guidance and regulation. There are a number of recommendations where we think the government work would really hasten. And like you said in the question, accelerate that momentum. And so that's absolutely a role to play there. But really the emphasis for us was about what we as an industry could do. But yeah, we don't disagree with that. So thank you for that comment. I sort of can thank Anna and Robin at this stage, and effectively you're dismissed because we're going to invite Eric on to join us in a minute. But Anna and Robin, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and it has just been such a pleasure working with you both, and I'm really looking forward to continuing working with you. But yeah, thanks for joining this session today. And Jackie, you've got a hold on the line if you don't mind. So, okay, great. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Anna. And so we're going to now welcome Eric Usher. Eric is the head of the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, calling in from very early morning in Geneva today. And we're really pleased that Eric's been able to join us. Eric and the UNEP FI more broadly has been really critical in catalysing a lot of the global momentum around sustainable finance, and in particular bringing forward and setting up some of the parameters and guidance as to what sustainable finance means and what are the elements that are required and what is sort of the thinking and the theory of change and how you put in place these roadmaps. And back in 2018, when this whole process really kicked off at a summit, an industry summit, where Eric came out to that, we signed off on a joint statement at that summit to start this process. And so it's really lovely to be welcoming Eric there. You are behind me there. Hi, Eric. I couldn't see you on the screen in front of me. Welcoming you, Eric, and it's a real pleasure to have you joining us, so thank you. And I wanted to hand over to you to get a bit of a sense of the global view on sustainable finance, and I guess giving that broader perspective as to where ASFI fits in some of the developments you're seeing globally. So welcome, really a pleasure to have you here, and I'll hand over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Simon, and a pleasure to be with you all, and also to listen in on the last session with Anna, Robin, and Jackie. Let me try to give a number of sort of reflections in terms of positioning this very important piece of work, and I think this very important, I would say, mobilization. I mean, to take the issue of the day, COVID. It has, I think it has shown how exposed we are to our unsustainable relationship with nature. And it's, essentially, many have described it as a stress test of business, of communities, of whole economies. And the results certainly have been telling. And I have to congratulate Australians and New Zealanders for the response. Certainly in the midst of it in Europe here, I would say there are appreciations, I think, of responses that maybe have been well organized. I think one obvious conclusion is that companies that are managed ESG factors more effectively or score higher on ESG, I can say, have performed better in the crisis. And as well, I think an important thing for people in our space is that the pandemic response really has been seen part of the sustainability agenda rather than something and something different. I think very importantly, the financial sector has performed largely to expectations in terms of the crisis response, and partially because the balance sheets are much stronger because of the last crisis. And the response to the global financial crisis certainly did take certain measures by regulators to actually put the financial system in a better position to be able to respond to these sorts of crises. Probably we would hope or assume that the health system is going to be rethought coming out of COVID. But I guess the obvious implications that the financial crisis strengthened the financial system, COVID will strengthen the health system. Let's hope that we don't always have to wait for the crisis to actually strengthen our systems. And obviously, when we look forward to issues like climate change or nature crises, we need to get prepared before. And some would say, well, that's too late. We're already in the midst of it. And obviously, the pace of response has to quicken even faster, I would say, on the climate crisis than what had already been thought. And Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, has said that we no longer have a decade to get on top of the climate crisis. We actually only have 3 years, and those 3 years being the years when the 10 trillion plus of stimulus measures are going to be deployed. And as we know, a lot of infrastructure is long life assets. And if we put stimulus into the wrong sort of infrastructure as we build back, then we're locking ourselves in. And there will be no way we can meet the Paris objective of well below 2 degrees. Now, I think while the awareness around climate-related risks has certainly rapidly increased, the financial sector, well, there are many areas, I think, of progress around climate, and at least we start to get a clearer idea of what needs to be done. But I think, as some of the previous speakers have already mentioned, that the awareness around nature-related risks are still at a very early stage. And World Economic Forum has estimated that there's $44 trillion US of economic value generation. That's more than 50% of global GDP that is highly or moderately dependent on nature. And the WEF's Nature Risk Rising and Global Risks reports, both this year, have highlighted the increasing scale of the nature-based risk issues that we need to be understanding. The risks of inaction, of being ill-prepared, are certainly immense, and we're seeing now with the pandemic, and certainly the benefits of getting it right are significant. And I mentioned that, actually I mentioned 10 trillion, it's actually 20 trillion of stimulus that has been announced so far related to the pandemic recovery. But according to the WEF, the finance for nature positive transitions that could be established by 2030 could generate up to 10 trillion in annual business value and create almost 400 million jobs. So the potential of getting it right is significant, not only in terms of nature and the planet, but also in terms of our economies. So Simon, you've asked me to give a bit of an overview of global sustainable finance developments. Let me move through these fairly quickly. I think many in the audience will be aware to some extent of many of these topics in a globally communicating world. At UNEP-FI, we've been around for almost 30 years. We were created at the Rio Earth Summit. So we have our 30-year anniversary coming up. But if I can speak about a couple inflection points over that period. 2006, the launch of the Principles of Responsible Investment. And for the first time, although the financial system had been putting in place environmental management systems at a transactional level for more than a decade, I would say, at that point. And the banks were the leaders, the first to identify and understand their liabilities from an environmental risk and later a social risk perspective. I think it was with the establishment of the PRI, where for the first time we really started to shift from a transactional to an organizational-wide integration of environmental social governance issues. Second major transition I would refer to is 2015 and the signing of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. And for the first time, these became global compasses to societies and individuals' needs. And the SDGs particularly or both of them were agreed by 190 plus governments. But I would say we were surprised, particularly with the SDGs, at how quickly the private sector picked them up and basically said, this is a useful tool to start to understand what are the issues that we believe we and society generally is going to be dealing with going forward, and what is our business strategy? What do we need to change to actually adapt to these changes or to help make them happen? I think post 2015, everybody started to do something green. It was expected of a corporation that you would have some green activities. I think also there was a lot of progress in terms of ensuring better financial sector decision-making through enhanced disclosures and transparency. And we were very pleased to support the development, but also for now, the implementation with our members of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. And now we're also involved with the establishment of the TNFD, which we've heard about already a little bit. I'll speak about it a little bit more later. I think since 2015, also governments and the private sector started to work together in preparing roadmaps of the sort that you've launched here for making the financial system sustainable. And we've supported these roadmaps in many countries, China, India, the UK, Canada, Luxembourg, and many more. I would refer to probably one of the most larger developments was the high-level expert group in the EU. And I think an important aspect of it was that, it was really, regulators were involved in inviting the establishment of such a group, but it was the private sector who composed the group and came up with a set of recommendations. A very in-depth overview of everything that could be done. And then the regulators and the policymakers picked up the recommendations and started to put many of them in place, including the EU Green Taxonomy, which comes into place March of 2021 through a delegated act, so it has been legislated, so that everything that claims to be green in the EU now has a taxonomy and has to show how it is green. We also have financial advisors who, in terms of their fiduciary duties, will be required to understand their customer beliefs around issues of sustainability, and importantly, for customers who do put a priority in these areas, these advisors are required to have products to address those beliefs. So to really make sure that the distributional channel to a changing customer force or face isn't blocked in any way, but actually it's very fit for purpose in terms of getting new products and services to a customer class that is changing. I think the TCFD is a great example, once again, where the private sector has been asked to generate the recommendations. And we believe within UNFFI, the relationship between private and public is critical for us to navigate the way forward. The private sector understands these issues better, but has to be motivated. And obviously every construct is different. Every political context is different. But I think it's this relationship over time that's very, very important. And we believe the TCFD update was so significant because so much latitude was given to the private sector to show how it should be done. I think many of you would be aware of the PRI research on the inevitable policy response. And the notion being that even if you're in a market where there isn't a sufficient policy response, look at the science doesn't lie, and it's certain that there will be a response in your market. The only thing is the later it comes, the more brutal it will be, and therefore it's not an excuse to sit back, it's actually an excuse to pay more attention and to be more ready for the inevitable policy response. The third inflection point I would speak about is happening now as we speak. And this is the shift from risks and opportunities when we think about sustainability considerations to the notion of full-scale alignment of portfolios and net zero, which is the most, I would say, the clearest version of this today. Obviously, the alignment also applies to other aspects of the SDGs and other societal challenges. So sustainability with this is no longer a sidecar. If you read your roadmap fully, you see that the days of issuing a green bond and saying you are green, I think, are past. It's really about the whole bond portfolio, how green it is, what your plans over time are to green it, this forward guidance. It's about the entire energy loan book, how much, what's the carbon intensivity of the entire loan book, and what are your plans to shift that over time. So I should point out, I'm referring a lot to actions by the private sector from the financial industry, and I think what's happening in Australia, what you've done is very impressive. I should, and for many years we talked about the private sector leading. Internationally, we have to mention the incredible developments amongst two actors, which is really happening very recently, that of regulators and that of governance, policymakers themselves, particularly here in Asia. Mark Carney did a great job of getting the ball moving from the Bank of England and is as chair of the Financial Stability Board. The French and the Dutch central bank governors then establishing the Network for Greening the Financial System in 2018. And today that includes, it's over 75 central banks and regulators and supervisors. Even the Fed, the US Fed, wants to join now. And if you look in their most recent financial stability report, which was just published on November 9th, they include a section on the implications of climate change for financial stability. What's happening everywhere, essentially. And meanwhile, the climate negotiations, which were a little bit stuck, we're coming up to 5 years anniversary since Paris on December 12th. And the ratchet mechanism of increasing ambition amongst countries wasn't going very far until 2 months ago when President Xi of China announced at the UN their 2060 net zero target. And this was followed by Japan, Korea. We would expect from the new Biden administration in the US as well, on top of the EU and many other countries. And many investors also have stepped up, and we have the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance that we're pleased to co-host with the PRI, which in Australia includes CBUS and QBE. That alliance of 30, I think it's 31 investors now. Together, it's about $5 trillion US in AUMs. They've released their protocol last month, which is their methodology where they set a target. It's not for 2050, because then the target is zero, but based on the science, the question, and this is where these net zero initiatives become very important, is what are you doing in 2025, 2030? And essentially, how is this becoming real? And this group of investors have set an ambition of a targets between 16 and 29%. They put out their protocol for consultation. That's closing, and they will finalize it. And most of the members, depending on when they join this Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, will announce targets this year, most of them in the lead up to Glasgow, which will be in that range. And obviously by 2025, a target of 27% reductions in the portfolio. It's a very significant step, which has very direct implications, not only on disclosure, but in portfolio composition. They've issued an aggressive position on coal, and they're focusing very much in terms of sectoral transition pathways. And I think, as many of you be aware, you can't think about net zero at an organization level or in terms of economy without quickly going to looking at the specific sectors and trying to understand how each sector, aviation, cement, steel, transport, energy, agriculture, how are these sectors going to make the transition to zero, and who are going to be the sector leaders, who are going to be the laggards. This is all about alignment, which is this third transition, as I said, it's happening now. I think it's becoming more and more clear. Now, I can't talk about alignment without mentioning the biggest development we've been involved in recent years, which is the establishment of the Principles for Responsible Banking. And as compared to the PRI and the PSI, which is Principles of Sustainable Insurance, those are essentially risk frameworks on integrating ESG into your operations. The Principles for Responsible Banking, the PRB, is a alignment framework. And the Principle 1 very clearly states that it's committing to align with the needs of society and individuals as defined by the SDGs and the Paris Agreement and other relevant frameworks. And then the Principle 2 is on impact assessment and target setting. And essentially, that's how you get the alignment. First, you have to understand your impact, positive, negative, from all lines of your business. And then once you understand these, once you prioritize these, once you focus more, it matters most, then you need to set targets. And at any one time, PRB signatories are required to be working on two, what are supposed to be the most significant targets that they have, which obviously vary by region. Principle 6 is on accountability, and very importantly, the PRB is the first major framework to have a assurance requirement for reported results. In Australia, we have ANZ, Westpac, NAB, Commonwealth, and Suncorp who have signed the principles so far. I want to just, in finishing up, Simon, some words on biodiversity and natural capital. And we were starting to work very actively with our members globally around these issues. It's an emerging area of focus, but obviously it's also very intertwined with the climate agenda. Some developments, we're certainly supporting the work of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, whose governments are negotiating a global biodiversity framework that's likely to be finalized in Q4 of 2021. And I think the ideal outcome would be a comprehensive global ambition around biodiversity, something akin to the 1.5 degree headline figure of the Paris Agreement. Essentially, something around bending the curve of nature loss by 2030, and something that would enable portfolio level metrics for biodiversity similar to the net zero approach that now is pulled on climate. Within the Principles for Responsible Banking, we have about 30 of our signatories globally who are developing guidance for setting and attaining biodiversity targets. This is going to be released in the second quarter of next year. And all PRB signatories are welcome to join and engage on this work. This is, I think, seen as a good place to start for financial institutions, and much of the activity in this area is well, Europe is probably in front on this topic, as in many of the sustainability topics, but we really welcome signatories from Australia and from the region to join this work. And we have this Natural Capital Finance Alliance, which is a group of financial institutions that have been developing this work in the area for quite some time. There's something called the Encore Tool, which stands for Exploring Natural Capital Opportunity, Risks and Opportunities, which is more of the technical underpinnings of helping financiers better understand and visualize the impact of environmental change on the economy. What happens when pollinators die off? How does that impact? What parts of your portfolio get impacted by these important nature inputs? And we're developing a new module to look at and monitor biodiversity targets, especially related to, right now, we're focusing on agriculture and the mining sector, which is going to be available in the second quarter of next year. We have an informal reference group with the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, on biodiversity, which is bringing together asset owners and managers to look particularly at biodiversity metrics, and interested members are certainly invited to join this work as it develops. And we also have an increasing area of focus looking at the blue economy, so the ocean and sustainable use of marine resources. And we have a new initiative called Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative which is starting to develop guidance on nature-related risks and opportunities around the oceans, from fishing and shipping to offshore renewable energy and coastal tourism. We're also finally, as mentioned, we're part of the core group establishing the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. And an informal working group has been set up, including around 30 of our members. And there's a 2-year program of work to actually establish the task force. Right now, the aim is to start to work on the reporting, the metrics, the data needs that would, can allow a better appreciation and starting to provide decision useful information. So I think in concluding, you know, the ASFI work, I think gives Australia and the roadmap from New Zealand, it captures extremely well all that's going on globally. And I think you have the advantage of building on a lot of very important progress and momentum that's building. And I think you're recommending pathways, policies or frameworks that will allow you to have a system that contributes much more systematically to the transition to this more resilient and sustainable economy. This notion of alignment and using based on the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and I think notionally, obviously, on other types of frameworks that exist or we will develop at a time. And this is really the heart of what UNEP-FI will on with our members. With that, I'd very much like to thank you for the opportunity to comment and also congratulations on a very significant piece of work.
Great. Eric, thank you so much for that. That was a really comprehensive tour of just how much is going on in the world. And I think it's been a great challenge and as you said, actually a great benefit for us to be able to draw on so much international work in our roadmap. I've been talking about us frequently saying that we're fast followers, we're not laggards in Australia. We're, and I think it's, you know, we really have benefited from the work and, you know, that area of biodiversity, natural capital is one that we really see on the radar as being really critical, and I think will accelerate very fast. I think your statistic there of $44 trillion have been moderately or highly dependent on nature and at risk of, there is just really exposes just the vulnerability that sits there, and I think Australia realised that in real time over the last 12 months, particularly with our summer of bushfires nearly 12 months ago. I just, you know, we're pretty much at time, but Jackie, I just wanted to pass to you for any concluding thoughts there as well, because obviously you wear, one of your hats is sitting as a co-chair of the UNEP-FI globally, and I think Eric was very polite in terms of avoiding a couple of elephants in the room there, but I'm not going to name, but I just welcome your sort of couple of minutes reflection on the international comparison, but also, I guess from the outset, Jackie, we spoke a lot at the Steerco of how we Australianify or Australianise the sustainable finance work under ASFI. So just interested in your thoughts and responses there. Oh, off mute, Jackie.
You'd think we'd all learn that by the end of this year, wouldn't we? But one of the things I'd like to congratulate Eric and leading the team this year, because at the beginning of this year, when COVID-19 occurred, the big concern across the finance sector globally was that the agenda would shift away from the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, and we haven't seen that. In fact, you know, one of the important stats we've seen at UNEP-FI is we've got 79 new members, and we'd already been growing by 2/3 over the last 5 years. So 79 new members, a quarter of an additional 25% of insurers and of banks says that this agenda didn't go away. In fact, people were reflecting on how important it was. And Eric and the team very quickly mobilised to make sure that as a collective, we can share cross-sector and cross-region. And I think that's been really pivotal, because then it's kept the agenda moving fast. And it means that any of the initiatives that we'd agreed to last year at the roundtable have kept moving. And in fact, when we talk to members, we hear that our tools have been relevant and more relevant this year. and actually more accessible because we've relied on virtual meetings a lot more, and also the connections that through UN partnerships has meant that we can access knowledge really quickly. And Eric referenced the TCFD, but now emerging with the TNFD. And I just think about the underwriting principles that have come through UNIPFI and how the insurers have all worked together. The one highlight I would say is that we're getting more seniority of people engaged at the UNIPFI level, because it's starting to be recognised this is a strategy conversation. And so when we look at the composition of the global steering group, we're seeing that it's hitting senior executives, and we've got one board member who's joined as a global steering group and been elected to the committee. So I think what we're seeing is this is becoming a mainstream agenda, as Eric said. Learning a lot from peers. I mean, when you think about ASFI, it actually came from a frustration we had after the HLEG report when we were sitting in London at a UNIPFI meeting, that we hadn't made progress in Australia to prepare ourselves for a future we had to face. And realising that as an industry we could step up and take leadership with the support of our peers internationally. And so to be able to piggyback on that learning is really, to me, the foundation of why I'm so passionate about UNIPFI too, because it's that global connectedness of thinking, not just capital, but the great minds coming together and understanding and learning and being very adaptive. And I think the other thing is the access of our training programs says a lot more people in our organisations want to access the information and to accelerate their own skills and capabilities. And so keeping up with the training demand has been really important. And that, I think, for our members, that's been a vital point of this year, as we've all struggled about how do you keep your people well informed and continuing to build skills in a year when they've had to work very differently. And so I think that's why our membership's been growing. But I also know the amount of sharing that happens across the global steering group, and also our boards for the principles of responsible banking, principles of sustainable insurance in particular, has accelerated things like the pilot groups of the TCFD. So I'll leave it there, Simon. But
Great.
Very big thanks to Eric for his input into ASFI. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd just echo that too, Jackie. A huge thanks to Eric and your team for the help that you've given us out here in terms of shaping up our work and seeding the work a couple of years ago, and really being a bit of a catalyst for driving that. And so, and with that, I will conclude this session. I think, as we said, on the ASFI front, it's been a collaborative and broadly inclusive process from the outset, and our intention is that we continue in that way, effective immediately, really, and going into our transition phase and then establishing a permanent body to deliver on that. So I really commend the report to people at this event to go and have a look at, have a read of. You'll be hearing more from us via ASFI. And just, finally, from a RIA perspective, I think our board at RIA made a decision very early on that it was really, really critical for RIA to commit a lot of resource and my time and some of my team's time to input into this process and delivering on that. And I think we still see that as just such an essential mechanism to drive the objectives of RIA and to work much more broadly across finance. So Jackie, it's been a pleasure the last year and a half working with you. I'm pleased we've got another 6 months or so at least to go. And Eric, I look forward to seeing you again soon as well. And so with that, we'll do the virtual applause that comes with a hybrid event such as this. And wish you a good Friday, Eric and Jackie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much. A pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you.